Yeah. I assumed it was the top part of this.
Yeah, that's
Cool.
perfect. Thank you. Appreciate it. How have you been?
Good. How about you? Too
Alright.
cold, right?
Yeah.
Not
very-
ready for the winter. But what can you do? It's New England.
Yeah, very busy. Which has been
Good. Yeah, right.
tough, but good. Yeah.
Yep.
Semester's coming to
The
an end.
infamous fall semester, which goes way too fast, is way too busy.
Exactly.
I don't know if I'm allowed to leave this on the table or not, but
I think
Not gonna-
it's a good look. Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
all right.
Oh,
get the branding off. And I'm supposed to look at you as I'm answering, right? That's the
Yes.
deal?
Yeah, that's
Perfect.
okay. All right, gentlemen, we're looking great. I'm gonna close the door. I guess I'm just gonna have to scoot you just for a second so I can
Okay.
close the door to prevent any sound waving and stuff like that. But just give me 10 seconds after I close the door, and I'll give you a thumbs up through here, and you can begin at that point. Okay?
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
We just got a thumbs up.
Okay.
We're good.
Okay, so we are ready to go.
All right.
All right. So, hello everyone. My name is Drew Tucker. I'm a senior here at Harvard studying economics. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Kevin Leppmann, Executive Director of the School of Honk.
Okay, and thank you for coming today.
Sure thing, Drew.
So, sorry, I'm coming over a bit of a cough.
Me too.
Yes. Okay. So first question that we have and what we're going to be speaking about today is kind of about like your involvement in the Honk Festival. So how are you personally involved? Like, what does your role actually consist of? And how do you think that contributes to the festival overall?
So I currently am executive director of a school that was inspired by the festival, but that's not where my relationship with the festival begins. It actually begins really at the beginning. In the early 2000s, I was in a band, Second Line Social Aid and Pleasure Society brass band, which formed 2003, I think, an improvisational opportunity at the first anti-Iraq war protest in Boston. I joined the band shortly after that protest, and for a couple of years, as our band was getting to know each other and as it was becoming a really life-changing experience for us, we found out about other similar bands in other cities around the country. And I remember one conversation in the fall of 2005, I think, with some bandmates about some of these other bands, Hungry March Band in New York, Brass Liberation Orchestra out in San Francisco. And I think it was John Bell, also one of the original Honk Festival Committee members, had suggested it would be great to have all those bands come together in one place and see what happens. And it was kind of immediately this crazy idea stuck in our heads for a while. And I went home that holiday season and wrote, I think, a 2-page proposal, manifesto, came up with this notion of honk as a kind of movement that was burgeoning in the early 2000s, at least in this country. And that became, after we got some other local stakeholders involved, that became a proposal for the very first Honk Festival. And then it was a few of us from that band that were part of the original organizing committee for the festival, and then for many years after that, for the first 9 or 10 years, I was also actively involved in that organizing committee year after year of the festival.
Right, okay. So earlier you said and mentioned that you were working with a school of honk, right? Well, what does that necessarily consist of?
So the School of Honk is a free, open community school that was in music school that was inspired by the Honk Festival. I think it was about 2014 was when we put the first call out at that Honk Festival that year to see if we could, one short answer is we didn't want to wait once a year to have this much fun. And we thought, could we have a really open musical spectacle that would share all the values of the Honk Festival like once a week? And so the idea is we'd have a truly open call, take people of any age, any background, any musical experience, and see if we could put together a brass band that would practice and parade every week. That was back in fall of 2014. We just celebrated our first 5 years, and it's been a tremendous success. But it was indeed inspired by that festival, and we take much of our values and our sensibility not only from the festival itself and the kind of spirit of openness and creativity and spontaneity, but also the values that underlie most of these community DIY, progressive, often politically focused, socially focused bands.
Right. Okay. So what would you say the Honk Festival is in your mind? If you could define it, yeah.
Ideally, I think when I think of the Honk Festival, I think of it as a time when we are most able to express a kind of connection, but also a kind of personal freedom that we don't generally experience most other times or places in our life. And there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of ways in which it differs from other kinds of spectacle in our society. We actually live in a very spectacular society that we're constantly being distracted or compelled by first commercial advertising, but also the formality of sporting events or other kinds of parades and spectacle. But this is a particular kind of spectacle. It's a particular kind of connection. And it, when I think of honk, I use several more metaphors. I think of it's kind of a Dr. Seuss moment, which is both, I think, conveys people a kind of visual notion of difference, but also a similarity among that difference, but also a set of values about the power of love and music and kind of common social humanity and the kinds of rituals and participatory spectacle that help reinforce that. Um, so the festival, as I say, if it's to the extent to which it's a success, it has provided a space and a forum where individually and collectively people can realize all kinds of creative possibilities, and particularly surprising, spontaneous possibilities. And that in turn, as it turns out, and this is kind of the flip side of what I learned, what I think a lot of us learned organizing the festival, that it isn't so much that you need to orchestrate new ideas or intuitions. You need to remove a lot of other obstacles that modern society puts in the way of having this kind of collective imagination and expression. That in fact, given the opportunity, and once you remove those other barriers, there is a natural inclination for people to sing and dance and laugh and play and love one another. But there are a lot of modern institutional, geographic, demographic, capitalist things that get in the way.
Right. Okay.
That's
So-
a long answer.
No,
but-
no, I appreciate it. Yeah. So what kind of prescriptive measures would you offer to like get that you've seen that have been effective in getting around these capitalistic like values, and how do you think that it can be applied to like other festivals as well?
I could only start a partial list, and again, hopefully, other people you're talking to they all have their own versions of this list, and
Yeah.
many of these things we've definitely come to agreement on. Let's start with some very specific examples. This has been important to our school, but it's also very important to the festival that it really be open to all, the whole community, and that means all ages, all classes, all genders, all backgrounds, whether those who know nothing about music or those that are have spent their life in that it's very important that it be radically inclusive in that way. You also have to reimagine public spaces, and the Honk Committee spends a great deal of time every year imagining how they're going to coordinate city stakeholders, local businesses, local residents in such a way that you could actually have, for extended periods of time, an open community space that is not directing traffic or directing people to go and buy things. And that actually takes a lot of work. It can be done, and especially in a community like Cambridge and Somerville, we have city officials and local businesses and residents who share this vision, but it actually is a tremendous amount of work to take a few days off, even just 1 or 2 days off from the usual, everyone in their little bubble and their own time routine going to buy things, or, so those are some of the very specific and very concrete things. In terms of, for example, some of the things that the school has learned from the experience of the larger experience of organizing the Honk Festival, and also talking to a lot of these bands. The school comes out of not just the inspiration of the festival itself, but numerous conversations many of us have had with other fellow musicians in other places. There's an approach to the music itself and learning the music itself that is also outside the mainstream ways in which people learn music. That we could go into the kind of different tracks. Usually by 10 or 12 years old, most people have decided for themselves whether or not they have musical talent. And from that point on, they either spend their life passively consuming as a listener music, or occasionally maybe going to a dance or singing in church. But other than that, they're not making music. They're consuming it. And then for the other, however percentage of people who think that they have the talent, then there are all kinds of commercial, educational, and other institutions that are designed to hone their skills and further separate them from their audience, for good and ill. And it's not that that's in itself bad, but it means that for most people, the action of actually making music, whether it be singing, dancing, playing an instrument, playing a drum, waving a flag, whatever, that's been pulled away from most people, and particularly in public education, and in particularly for the wind and brass instrumentation. It's I don't want to make any enemies, but I don't think it's an understatement to say that, or an overstatement to say that, American music education, I think, has really failed kids in providing not just a few kids, but most students, the ability to stay connected to music making. Doesn't mean kids don't listen to music, they do. It's a very important part of their life. But early on, they've made a decision that they can't be a part of it. They can only be a consumer in a mass consumer society. They consume the music, but they don't produce it. And that's just utter nonsense. Virtually all people have a musical sensibility that either gets first of all, that's visible in 5-year-old kids who all dance and sing and play. As soon as the band starts, they are the first ones who know that this is a musical opportunity for them to wiggle their body, to go and touch the musicians. That's the very real, authentic response that the adults never do right away. Hopefully over time, certainly by the end of the festival, let's say, they are also shaking their booty.
Yeah.
But what's happened is that over the years, they have become estranged from that musical playfulness in themselves.
Yeah.
And both the school and the festival that inspired it is all about erasing that boundary between performers and audience. It's about getting people to own up, not just to own, but to be awakened by their musical sensibility and realize the power that it has, not only to give themselves a sense of individual identity and expression and freedom, but to feel connected to other people, because their own expression is dependent on this love and support, musical and other support they get from the people around them.
So what aspects of the festival do you believe that actually like promote and facilitate like this engagement like from the crowd to like, you know, to, as you said, get their booties moving? What aspects can you think like, okay, this is what draws people in, this is what keeps it going?
Again, I can only start at a list.
Yeah.
But for example, when a big piece of the philosophy here is that for example, there are no stages and no sound equipment, and that's a very important. It's not just a feature of the instrumentation of these bands. These bands were very much informed by being street bands, and that not having a stage is one way in which you just very palpably and immediately express to the audience that they are not just an audience, that you are not above them, you are not removed from them, you are not abstracted from them, you're not representing them. You are representing yourself and your group and whatever they're doing collectively together, but you're also you're trying to embolden the audience to get involved, to dance, to think about picking up a horn they haven't picked up in 20 years and doing something really fun with it. Or so there's that physical, the way in which the lay of the land for this weekend festival is very important, and we give a lot of thought to that. Also with the way that it's powered, both financially and in terms of the labor that's involved. From beginning to end, there is a constant reminder that we are not a big corporate sponsored festival where we're paying performers, and on top of that, asking a large corporation to foot $50,000 or $100,000, a very small amount for a big music festival. It's all people powered, both financially and in terms of the festival itself, where musicians stay. They stay in homes, not in hotels. Local businesses, especially local independent businesses, are a big part of the financial and the political support that we get for kind of shutting down the first Somerville and then Cambridge 2 days in a row.
Yeah.
So this kind of grassroots community stakeholders being involved in the production of the festival and in financing the festival is also a big part of the inclusiveness.
Okay.
I could go on, but those are.
No. That's good. That's good. So, next question. How do you feel that being on the other side of the festival, of helping, image production and seeing how like it operates, has afforded you like a different appreciation or experience like for the Honk Festival?
It definitely has. I'm smiling in part because indeed much of the School of Honk, not just me but the other people that I started that school with, we had all had experience not only playing street band music, which was really important, but also experience organizing the festival. Virtually all of us did, and are keenly aware of some of the things that we learned and some of the challenges that the festival had to organize in these ways with these values. Are some of the same challenges, maybe in a different form, that we face in the school. But just to go back, your particular question was, what has this perspective allowed?
Yeah.
I'm tempted to give just an anecdote.
Oh yeah, or maybe a better way to phrase this question be, like what do you get out of the experience of Honk from actually helping like put it on?
From organizing it as opposed to just being a player participant, exactly. Right. Yeah. Many different things, many different rewards. In some ways, simply an extension of what I hope. For me, being a musician is not a metaphor for being a good person. It's a piece of the foundation of being a good person. And I think part of my own philosophy about musicianship is that it entails all the qualities we'd want in a sense of, do unto others and listen and, be honest. All those things are true as a musician, I think, are true a larger basis. I think they're a way to aspire to be good humans. And one thing that I think we all shared in that organizing committee, and that we do also in the school, is that sense that some of our musical intuitions in turn can inform and help us understand our what we might think of as more general obligations to each other and ways in which we're inspired by each other. But I do want to go back to one anecdote from the very first year that I think does encapsulate this distinction between being a musician participant, let's say, and actually organizing the festival. And it was one of the other original founding organizers, Dr. Maury Martin, longtime doctor in Somerville, member of Second Line Social Aid and Pleasure Society. He and I were in Harvard Square on the first Sunday of the first festival in 2006. And I think he had overheard it and then relayed it to me. He overheard some musician from some band asking another member of their band, saying, geez, I can't believe what it must have taken to organize this. And the response from his bandmate says, well, how much can it be? You just put out a call and have people show up. And those two responses gave us a great deal of satisfaction. One was that all the bands that came, it turned out very quickly, understood that it did take a great deal of work in various ways, a labor of love that was, but that it took an extraordinary effort to actually create a festival that had never been done before, certainly not in the United States. There had been some similar festivals in Europe that we had been inspired by, one particular Spandata in Italy, but this was the first of its kind. On the other hand, our festival was going to be a success, we all agreed, to the extent to which people would not see all of that effort. They would think of it as a spontaneously erupting moment of collective joy and imagination and mutual respect. That it wasn't something that had been manufactured. It was more something that had been nurtured. And that is how the vantage point of the people on the organizing committee of the festival, in some ways as the mentors that run the School of Honk, same idea is we're doing best when it is invisible, when the organization piece of it is not at the forefront. What's at the forefront is something natural, potentially spontaneous, open-ended. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. Another version of this that we talk about a lot with the School of Honk, if you want to ensure spontaneity and surprise, have a plan. That in fact, if you don't have a rough plan, a general idea of what's going to happen, it's actually not going to be spontaneous at all. It's going to immediately fall back on familiar routines and tropes and particular personalities or particular musicians. You think of a jam that's supposed to be an open jam, and then it pretty quickly, you turn out with the same group of people who are playing the same songs over and over again, and other people have kind of left out. There are many ways in which having a plan, and from the vantage point of an organizer, knowing what that plan is, allows for a whole series of things to happen that no one could have envisioned, and that a lot of participants are not aware of kind of some of the background details, but they don't need to be. They can still be very much present and very much creators of the moment without having all of that organizational baggage.
Right. Okay, yeah.
I don't know if
So,
that's
no,
gives you
that's
a good
perfect.
idea.
That's perfect. Thank you. So in our own music festivals class, we're considering the effect that like activism has in like music festivals and what role it actually plays. What would you say that what kind of like activist message or political message would you say that Honk kind of promotes, if it does have any?
It's certainly not going to be one. The one thing it definitely promotes is an understanding that this kind of music, participatory, people-powered music, is extraordinarily powerful in any number of ways in which you are trying to bring a community together. And even for a number of the bands that come to the Honk Festival, they don't have a larger political program or mission other than it could be just community revitalization. They're just a hometown favorite. Usually in some way it has to be open and inclusive in some way, but it's not like they are associated with a particular political movement. It's not necessarily, even for a lot of these bands, that they see their main cause as to be enlivening political actions. And as you'll probably hear from other people who talk about the festival, since its beginning, we've all understood that even without having any kind of explicit political program, we see this kind of music and this kind of engagement with the community as radical. It's something that doesn't happen in our culture without a lot of work. It doesn't happen naturally anymore. Maybe it did thousands of years ago, when the community, the village would just come together and sing and dance and play. But for a very, very long time, that's not been the case.
Yeah.
Then there's the question of, or for me, I imagine, aside from just that basic political program of reinvigorating community spectacle and performance as a form of binding communities together, what are the particular political programs or kinds of actions or rallies where our kind of music and our kind of engagement with the audience would be most helpful? And I don't know that I could speak to that specifically. I know that in a general sense, for me, and this is very much my own personal view, is that actually the effectiveness of this kind of music is going to depend on reinventing the traditional form of political rally. That, like a lot of other people, I long ago became pretty disenchanted with what seemed to me often a disempowering standard script for a political protest, centered around photo ops, because you hope to get one picture in the paper that someone would see, and if you were lucky, a 30-second soundbite from someone speaking through a bad speaker system on a dais. A lot of these bands got their start because they wanted to reinvent this script. They wanted to do something much more engaging and fun and uplifting.
Yeah.
And a lot of these bands got their start trying to help other political movements and particular organizations rethink, well, how are you going to stage a protest that's really going to compel people to watch, as opposed to, let's face it, certainly for most of my life, rallies and demonstrations were things that most everyone else walked away from. They would hear the bullhorn and they'd say, oh, there must be something going on there, I'm going to walk the other way. So the idea is, how do you reverse that?
Yeah.
And since getting people to the rally was only one of several priorities and not usually the main priority, that, in a sense, that didn't make sense from the perspective of the traditional rally organizers. Their main thing was a good soundbite, a good photo op, maybe a head count that you could say had arrived, and that was what they were trying to achieve. I definitely think the most successful political rallies these days, that at least the ones that I look to that are inspiring, are either using music or some other method to engage people and really participate at a very visceral level. One example, the Women's March right after the Trump inaugural, the next day. The Pink Hats was another example where people could bring their own individual contribution. They were making these hats, and that and the symbolism of all wearing those hats, to me, was just as powerful as the total number of people who showed up in giving people a connection to that movement. And a lot of the bands that come to the Honk Festival are bands who think all year round, try and think strategically about which political actions do we think we would bring the most to, and how can we bring our value without it just being what it often is, quite understandably. Originally, the band was there to kind of start the show, maybe end the show, boost the show, maybe play a couple of hits in between speakers, but it was very much an addendum. It was more like icing on the cake, and the cake was the talking and the testimonials and the speeches from politicians or others. For me, I'm not saying there's never a time for that kind of rally, but to me the power of these bands comes when actually the bands and the music they're creating and the spectacle that they're creating is the main event. Have signs, let people know what your message is. Right. Everyone deserves a home was the message at this year's Song Festival. Well, that's a very politically loaded form of resistance. It can be read in many different ways. But the music and the dancing and the laughter and the playing, that's what's going to bring lots of formerly asleep, hopefully soon to be awake citizens out from under. They'll see the signs. They know what's up. They don't need a large explanation. They need to see the inspiration that comes from especially the most radically inclusive group you can imagine portraying to them. Yeah, go ahead. I'm going on and on here. No worries.
Good to go?
Yeah.
Okay. So last question. So we've been discussing this idea of authenticity, and with how the Honk Festival has changed in the past and like looking forward to the future. How would you say that like the festival can stay authentic to what you define as the Honk experience, and how might this change? And like what are the basic tenets that you think that will carry the Honk spirit throughout time, even if we see like a political or an activist message, come more into importance, or see the entire program develop in its totality?
I think it's an ongoing accomplishment to trying to retain that authenticity. So, definitely, part of me wants to believe that the basic principles that are manifest in so many different ways, including in writing, in terms of how the festival organizes itself, that if we're able to stay true to those principles, come what may, whatever might change, the principles and the vision that lay behind them about what a better world looks like and how we might try and get there, I think that's a good guide, but it's ongoing work to reinterpret whatever particular local circumstances of the community here or anywhere else we try and do it, and figure out how those principles speak to the particular conflicts or injustices or lack of representation that any community has. And I know that for us, it has been an ongoing effort with many different stakeholders, with many different communities, to try and make sure that communities that weren't represented before find a place to express themselves in this festival in one way or another. That's been a very upfront piece of the work that the Honk Festival does every year, even more than other Honk festivals. At the forefront is, what can we do this year that recognizes a particular movement or a particular political moment? And I think the thing to avoid, or at least for me, the kinds of things to avoid moving away from that authenticity, is this sense that a ritual has a legitimacy just as a ritual in itself. We should just do it next year because we did it last year or we did it the last 20 years. It's not that each ritual has to kind of be defended from scratch every year, but it is a sense that just having done something a certain way or having provided a certain kind of framework in the past, it's being able to have an open, transparent conversation with the current stakeholders and say, does this make sense this year? And have people come to us saying, we don't see ourselves reflected in this festival. Is there some way we can bring our community or our concerns or our aspirations to the festival in a way that still honors all the things that the festival's about, but also kind of give us voice? I think the question of authenticity is the question of our time in some ways, and so it's both no surprise, but I also have to say that it's rewarding to think that I'm working with others on a project that is trying to ask those questions of authenticity right up front and say that is the deal. We want to make sure that this music isn't ever becoming that abstracted, consumed representative, as opposed to concrete, in the moment, authentic, human-made, with all of its miscues and sour notes. It's real, and everyone's authenticity has a place for expression. That's an ongoing project, but it is so much at the forefront of how this festival has envisioned itself. And when we talk with other bands and other organizers and other festivals, they're on the same page in this respect, which is very, it's very encouraging.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful to hear. It's beautiful to hear. Well,
Was that helpful, you
That was
think?
incredibly helpful, and thank you for speaking.
Thank you.
With me. Yeah,
Thank you.
Definitely. Okay. So
Yeah, we're done, right?
Yes, we are. I believe so. Oh man, I'm just getting over this cold, and the scarring off from my cough has been.
It's that time of year, my friend. The only reason I'm not coughing is because I'm pumped up on Dayquil. I caught a
Exactly
very
right.
bad cold last Wednesday or Thursday, I think, and I wasn't even able to venture out until Sunday.
Wow.
So it's the way it is.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying
But,
to get over this one. Did everything come out okay? Perfect.